All right, today we have on Dr. Jason Moser, who's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Michigan State University and the director of the Clinical Psychophysiology Lab. The lab centers on the interplay between emotion, cognition, and behavior in the context of mental health, especially focusing on anxiety and depression. Jason, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
No, yeah, I appreciate it. Like we were just saying, our work kind of overlaps with what we're doing. So I'm excited to pick your brain a little bit about the emotion regulation strategies that you're using and what kind of like the future of your work and then what that entails as well. One of the things that you kind of built a lot of your kind of reputation on is this idea of cognitive control and how
hmm
people can utilize that as far as like self-regulatory abilities of being able to control the things that they focus on and how that relates to anxiety and the way that you measure it. So would you mind kind of giving a quick breakdown of what exactly cognitive control is and then how you guys measure it in your lab and like what are some of the things that you're finding with the cognitive control research that you're doing?
Yeah. I started off really interested, specifically in cognitive control around mistakes. And so that was a lot of where I entered the conversation about cognitive control and how that might be affected by emotion, and then how that might tell us something interesting about anxiety and depression, and maybe even tell us something about how we might treat anxiety and depression in particular ways. And so, really, for me, where I started was very much like cognitive control is about, how well in a situation where the goals and demands are pretty clear, how well are you able to stay focused on those goals and demands of the task at hand, and continue to pursue those goals and meet the kind of parameters of the task over some sustained period of time. And if things go awry, if you make a mistake or you get distracted for some reason, maybe it's because the experiment is actually rigged that way on purpose to distract you or to present stimuli that are a little conflicting, like we often use the flanker task, and we've used the arrow flanker task. We've used versions of it that use letters as well, where we're trying to show people, multiple competing stimuli that pull for opposing responses, and what happens when you're asked to really focus your attention, stay on task, meaning respond to whatever you see in the middle of the screen and don't worry about other things on the screen that appear in the periphery or maybe somewhere else in your view. How well are you able to resist that distraction, stay focused on the task, respond as we're asking you to? And if you can't, and you lap and your attention lapses, and you make a mistake, how well do you bounce back? How well do you re-engage in a way cognitive control, kind of reactivate those goals, those task parameters, those instructions to then perform the task as we've asked you to, which is usually do it correctly and do it quickly. And so that's really where I started, was just like cognitive control is about how well you can kind of stick to the task at hand, and when you do lapse, how well do you rebound and get back on track. um, so I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that, but
Yeah. So, besides the task at hand, how are you measuring? You guys use EEG, correct? And
right.
how are you measuring the relevancy of whether the task had a negative impact or a positive impact? You guys use things like the error-related negativity spikes within
Right.
EEG. Can you kind of go over those differences and like what that tells us when the person is making that, and kind of quantify that with the actual mistakes that they are making?
Yeah. So, with there's simple two choice reaction time tasks that are speeded. So we're asking people to, hey, the target, the thing you're supposed to pay attention to is in the middle of the screen. And sometimes you're going to see stuff in your periphery. You don't really have to pay attention to that. So really focus your attention on the middle of the screen. And obviously, when you have things in the periphery that are pulling for the exact opposite response, let's say, the thing in the middle of the screen is you've been given an instruction that means you should press the left mouse button. Um, and then we present things in the periphery that pull for a response with the right mouse button. And then you get distracted and you press the right mouse button instead of the left one, you've made a mistake. So the first thing we do is we record their accuracy and their reaction time. And what normally happens in these sort of two choice speeded reaction time tasks is when you give people kind of conflicting information where one stimulus asks them to press one button and the other stimulus asks them to press the exact opposite button or a different button, you see people slow down and they make more mistakes on those types of trials. And so cognitive control is basically measured from person to person in a way, like how good your cognitive control is how much do you have to slow down to stay focused on the target in the middle of the screen. If you have to slow down a lot, that means maybe you don't have the greatest cognitive control and you're distractible. And on those sorts of trials where there's this distracting information, do you make more mistakes than the average person? And if you make more mistakes, then again, it seems like you're distractible and you don't have the best cognitive control. And then what we're also able to see, so accuracy and reaction time are handy in and of themselves. And then we record a lot of EEG. And in the EEG, we look a lot at the error-related negativity is how much does your brain kind of reboot you in a way after the mistake. So after you press a button that's wrong, your brain generates this automatic little blip in the EEG signal that we can see that shows up at like the front of the head. We think it comes from the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the ACC, which is a pretty big component of the kind of cognitive control system in the brain. And what it does is it kind of signals that something's gone awry. We need to re-engage attention. We need to re-engage in the task so that we can get back on track. And what we've seen with the kind of magnitude of the error-related negativity or the ERN is, kind of the bigger it is, the more cognitive control generally a person has. The smaller it is, it seems that the person has less cognitive control. And so what's been really interesting for me in terms of like, okay, well, what might that tell us about anxiety, which has kind of been this long-term 20-something year now love-hate relationship with this little brain blip is, what is it actually telling me about anxiety? Because what has been found over the years in other people's research, and we've done a lot of this research as well, is that anxious people with anxiety disorders, people with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, tend to have bigger ones of these ERNs. They also tend to be more distractible and a little slower. Not necessarily always more error prone on these kind of conflicting trials, but they tend to be a little slower. And they have this bigger ERN. So it seems like the cognitive control in anxiety and OCD is kind of confounding in a way because they have this big ERN, which suggests maybe they don't have the best, maybe they have really good cognitive control actually, but their behavior tells us a different story, which is, well, maybe they actually don't have great cognitive control because they're also distractible. And it's really that kind of paradox that I've been obsessed with for a very long time, not in an OCD way. Um, but I've been really, really fascinated by it. That's really been kind of my entry point into just trying to really unpack what is it about cognition, emotion, how they interact with each other, how they affect each other, and what that tells us about anxiety and its treatment. So it's like that conundrum that I unpacked over the past 10 or so years of like, why do folks with anxiety have kind of a bigger ERN, which suggests maybe they have more cognitive control, but their behavior suggests that they have poorer cognitive control.
Yeah, and that goes to the idea that these disorders are more complex than the singular brain regions that we're looking at, right?
Right.
Like the whole monoamine hypothesis of serotonin being the biggest
Sure.
driver, right? So it definitely so within this paradox, what have you hypothesized of to maybe why this exists and what do you think it's connected to?
Yeah, so I mean, at first, a lot of people were just kind of like not thinking a ton about cognitive control with relationship to this big ERN and anxiety. They were actually saying, "Oh, this big ERN and anxiety must mean that people with anxiety are afraid of mistakes," because it kind of like intuitively makes sense. Oh, people with anxiety are afraid of bad things happening. When you ask them to engage in a task in the lab, a bad thing that could happen is they could make a mistake. They're kind of perfectionistic, maybe, and that's why they have this bigger ERN, but it was never really interpreted in the context of actually a much larger literature that's been out there for even more decades. Mostly kind of pioneered by Mike Eysenck over in London, who's observed for many, many years that there is, again, this kind of paradox where if you just have behavioral data, it appears that folks with anxiety are slower at tasks, but not more error prone, which is kind of a, you know, it's again kind of a question mark is like, well, what's that about? But I'm a clinical psychologist as well, and I know the kind of top accommodation that anxious students get is more time. So anxiety does distract us, and so there were a bunch of studies that so while I'm kind of thinking about cognitive control more broadly and how it relates to anxiety, other people were kind of stuck on this. The ERN means that people are afraid of mistakes. And I was kind of like a little on the fence about that because there are a bunch of other data that don't quite fit that narrative. One in particular was my actual master's thesis, which is my first project I did when I was a graduate student at the University of Delaware in 2010, eons ago. And what we tried to do is we tried to scare undergraduates who had spider phobia in the lab, and we recorded their ERN while they performed a flanker task while I hung out in the room with them with a tarantula in my hands, walking it through. So I had to get over my fear of spiders first. And I
Yeah.
did that for half of the experiment. The other half of the experiment, I used a koosh ball and just like walked it on my hands. If anybody knows what the heck a koosh ball is anymore, but it's like this rubbery, hairy looking thing that was, fun kind of fidget toy. So they'll look kind of like those stringy fidgets now that people have. But anyway, what we figured was, hey, let's induce fear in these undergrads with spider phobia, and if that fear kind of translates or migrates to their fear of mistakes, then we should have a bigger ERN in these undergrads with spider phobia while they're scared with the tarantula in the room versus when we're just playing with the koosh ball. And of course, that didn't pan out at all. Instead, what we found more was they were just more distracted and they weren't paying as close attention to the flanker task when I was in there with this spider who we called Laverne, Lavern. And they were more distracted, but they actually didn't perform much differently, and their ERN was kind of like was completely unaffected. There were some other brain potentials that were smaller, some attention brain potentials that suggested they weren't paying as much attention. But that was like one piece of evidence, like, well, maybe it's not about anxiety. And there are a number of other findings that don't quite line up, in terms of when you make errors more costly, let's say in a task by incentivizing them with points or money. Folks with anxiety don't have even bigger and bigger ERNs, which you might expect if they're afraid of mistakes. They should be afraid of mistakes that are more important or more costly. And that doesn't really seem to pan out. So I have basically kind of jumped over to Mike Isink and his group. We just actually wrote a review paper that just came out, kind of speaking to how the ERN fits in their broader narrative about the cognitive control deficits and anxiety broadly, which is what I think is actually going on. And this has kind of, again, led to a number of other kind of discoveries and ways of interpreting kind of cognitive control and emotion regulation and how hard that is for people with anxiety and depression and OCD and trauma. Is that what's happening actually in these silly little tests in the lab is folks with anxiety come in and they're pretty motivated to perform well. But they also have distracting, anxious thoughts that are likely banging around in there. They worry about how they're doing. They worry about whether they got a good grade. They're worried about finances, maybe whatever it is. But they come to the task kind of already dual tasking by having their head filled with all these worries. And for the most part, they can stay focused. And what I think proposed, which was kind of the key to the whole kind of conundrum, was why would it be that if anxious people are more distracted by things in their head, why would they actually like be pretty good at tasks, maybe slower, but not error prone, not like really bad at tasks? Is that we know plenty of, I'm sure you know plenty of these people as I do, we know a lot of overachieving anxious people out there. So what happens with anxiety, it's kind of this double pathway where on the one hand, they're more distracted, but there's an awareness of that distraction. So they overcome it by engaging in more effort. And so they put more effort in the task to achieve a pretty similar level of performance as people who are non anxious, but it comes at a cost of being effortful, being tiring. And if you've heard people say, I'm so exhausted or so overwhelmed by this, I can get a good grade, but it's so tiring. That's what I hear from my clients all the time. I have a lot of high functioning clients who have anxiety disorders and the like, and for the most part their lives are okay, but it's really exhausting, and they describe burnout. So what I feel like the ERN is doing is the ERN is kind of the for anxious folks, it's their brain's ability to kind of, they have to put in more effort to rebound and pay attention and re-engage in the task after a mistake than somebody who's not anxious. So it's not about being afraid of mistakes. It's actually, it takes a lot of effort, and the signal in their brain that helps them engage that is this ERN signal, which is like, it says, hey, wake up, we got to pay attention. But that signal's bigger because they need to engage more attention and take more effort to kind of get back on track, if that makes
Okay,
sense.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And is this something that they're consciously aware of, that they are aware that it's going to take more effort? They go into it knowing that effort is the thing that they need to focus on, or is this very unconscious, subconscious of their test taking?
Well, in this particular scenario, in the ERN task, it's completely implicit. So we don't kind of ask that much about effort. There are, some other signals like, that we can measure implicitly that kind of speak to the same idea. Like, they tend to have higher skin conductance responses when they're engaging in a task, which can also mean they're engaging more effort. But in the ERN test, we're generally kind of interpreting the ERN just based on it itself. But there's a ton of other data that if you actually ask people with anxiety, hey, how how did you find this task? They often will self-report it was more effortful. Other studies that use peripheral physiology also find higher effort rating, have higher effort scores and like skin conductance and the like. And so if you put all this together, if you explicitly ask them or you see kind of their brain dynamics in real time, it suggests that what they're experiencing in the moment is that they have to put in more effort to kind of get the same result out. So it's like, the old comparison between if I drive a Chevy Impala and pump it with all its gas and it chugs through all that gas for 50 miles versus a Prius, you're working less efficiently because you're kind of always dual tasking and always kind of trying to overcome the distracting effects of the worries in your brain. And so we're continuing to try to connect to those things as much as possible with multiple measures at the same time. But what we've done so far is say, hey, here's what the ERN looks like. We have a bunch of experiments to kind of test this idea um, about effort and what happens if you increase effort or decrease effort. Or we did a study where we asked, just one kind of quick example is, we did an expressive writing study where we had folks who identified as high in worry come in two different groups. One group wrote about how they brushed their teeth in the morning. They had a cup of coffee, completely unrelated. The other group came in and wrote about how nervous they were about the task, what they were worried about doing, that they were going to fail, that we were going to able to read their thoughts and see how anxious they were and how much they struggle. And sure enough, the group that got the expressive writing right before the ERN task had a smaller ERN when they made mistakes than the group that just wrote about their day, even though both groups performed exactly the same. And so we basically said we made the folks with worry who got all their worries out, they offloaded all those worries beforehand. We made them more efficient at the task. They didn't have to use as much energy basically to do the task because we got rid of those worries for them. Um, and so all these different data together, we've kind of put together to suggest that it really seems like hyperactive brain activity that we see in some of these these are purely cognitive tasks. Like there's no emotion in these tasks really, except for maybe if you have wins and losses or certain points, and then it's kind of motivational. In these tasks without emotions, it really does seem that they're trying to kind of stay engaged, and it takes a little more for them to stay engaged. Than a person who's not anxious, which again fits totally with what we see in real life. Is test taking for college students who are anxious, the number one accommodation that you get at a resource center or whatever is you always just get more time, which makes sense because if you had more time you can do just as well. But the problem for folks who don't get accommodations who are anxious, they can look like they're struggling more because they just don't have enough time because they're constantly trying to overcome the distractions of the worries in their head.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Do you know if there's any research? Have you guys any done research where you have somebody come in, they do the task, and then you have them maybe come in, 4 hours later to repeat the task to see if that spike in the ACC causes a depletion? So maybe they're worse at the task later on. Like think of it as like a college student has an exam in the morning, and then they have
Mhm.
exam in the afternoon. Are we talking about glucose depletion of that brain area that makes them not be as efficient or be able to, maybe the errors become magnified because they're just not cognitively as sharp as they once were because it got
Right.
depleted so much.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a study just like that. It makes a lot of sense to do that. What we do have is we have evidence where for people with anxiety, they're more likely to make more errors in the second half of the task than are people with non with less anxiety. So the idea being the same as what you were just suggesting is as they tire, the majority of most of the mistakes in this sort of like really simple video game task, you know, are in the second half or in later in the experiment for lots of people, but it's even more so for people with anxiety.
Yeah, and then how do you think that relates to the idea of the whole willpower hypothesis of that being able to get depleted by Roy Baumeister? Are you
Yeah,
familiar with that? With the idea
yeah.
that willpower can be depleted over time, and um, is correct me if I'm wrong, but is that relegated to the anterior cingulate cortex as well? That motivation kind of resource area?
Yeah, I mean, it's more complex as you alluded to earlier, right? That we're not just talking about the ACC rules all of this. The ACC is a hub, and that's why I'm so fascinated by it and have been obsessed by it. But it's a hub that receives information from all sorts of other areas of the brain. So it receives information from the lower parts of the brain, which might be the more core motivational systems. Like it receives information from the amygdala and kind of the emotion centers. It receives information from the basal ganglia and kind of these reward dopamine hit areas. And so it's trying to integrate information from the bottom up, but it's also receiving information from other cortical areas that are trying to tell it, hey, what are the parameters of this task again? What are we supposed to be paying attention to? There are a lot of these feed forward and feed backward um, connections that the ACC has. But what I can say is I do think that what the ACC tells us and what we know from the work with anxiety and kind of depletion is um, I do think it's the case that for many people with anxiety, their kind of working memory capacity or their cognitive capacity is somewhat depleted, and you just kind of have to tap into it just right. Like this is why anxiety fascinates me the most because we were also talking before we got on about exercise and exercise can be helpful to anxiety and we know that um, anxiety can interfere with performance, and so there's this whole kind of like very much a bi-directional relationship where anxiety can actually boost performance at some level by there's these kind of like peak zones right of performance and some of that is about stress or about activating the system. So anxiety is about activation, which I do think helps the system kind of engage and pay attention, right? A lot of what anxiety's kind of natural functions are is to kind of like keep us alert and pay attention to the environment so that we don't get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or whatever, or be beaten with a club by one of our members of our tribe who don't like us so much anymore. So like it has this activating and attention focusing, element to it, but it can also backfire and it can be associated with distraction and distress when it goes awry and when it keeps us kind of out of touch with what's going on in the environment. So I think anxiety in and of itself is depleting, and I think what we see the effects of that depletion, you can see on performance, whether it's in cognitive task or sport performance, or you see it in relationship performance, let's call it, or whatever else, or on the job performance, is very much a kind of depletion, so to speak, effect where anxiety just kind of saps those resources that would otherwise be dedicated to what we're supposed to be doing in that moment. Just like if I were super anxious about interacting with you on this podcast, right, I would be stumbling a lot. I might be not responding for long periods of time. And that's a depletion effect because I'm not meeting the demands of our task right now because maybe I'm somewhere else in my head worried about what you think of me or what listeners might think, or I'm thinking about what I got to do next.
Yeah. So if there's a depletion effect going on, how do we begin to replenish that, rebuild that?
Yeah.
With the willpower thing that comes to mind is, they did the research on it showing that willpower does get exhausted, but then Carol Dweck from Stanford, she did research to show that if you believed that your willpower was going to be deteriorated, then
Yeah.
it did. And if you believed that it wasn't going to, then it didn't, right? So I know you
Mindset,
do
right.
some, yeah, I know you do some work with beliefs and mindset and how
Yep.
that changes the trajectory. So what are some intervention type strategies that maybe we could use with anxious people to help replenish this idea
Hmm.
of depletion throughout the day? Whether it also be something along the lines of like glucose absorption and
Hmm.
taking in carbohydrates before you do a task to make sure that your glucose is fully, your glycogen is fully stored and all that type of stuff. What have you found to be
Yeah.
both clinical and in the research to be effective to help kind of replenish this depletion?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it back to willpower. I wanted to say a bit more about that. Is, willpower is and about replenishing in general, and it's an interesting way to think about it. Um, what I will say about willpower is, I don't know, willpower is just so tricky because it's such a loaded term. You know what I mean? Everybody's very upset about willpower, right?
Yeah,
Or like so many people talk about it and they're like so into willpower. So it feels like such a lightning rod concept that I don't generally talk about willpower as a thing generally. I'm generally just talking about like, well, what are the dynamics at play for the different motivational systems and the multiple tasks or resources that a person has and they're allocating to various things. Like, how does that all play out? Whether we have this kind of, maybe instead of willpower, we could talk about a reserve, that we have a reserve available to us. And that what I've found interesting about, people with anxiety is actually it does look like they do have a reserve, right? In a way, because yes, if you ratchet up the stress and you ratchet up the difficulty of some particular task, whatever it is, you can start to see breakdowns in performance for people with anxiety. We know what that looks like, choking under pressure or whatever, right? But in a lot of different ways, at a moderate level of difficulty or stress, like anxious folks can dip into a reserve and overcome that to still do pretty well, right? And so I'm more kind of interested in how do people solve problems with the resources they have at their disposal, and when things break down, what do they do about it? What do they do about it next? And so I think the concept, so willpower, I'm kind of going to put aside for a second, if you don't mind. But this idea of like replenishment, or what does growth mindset do for us, right? So I think there are lots of different ways to think about either replenishing or the way, and I want to go back to that notion in a little bit, but what we've kind of done is we've tried to give people tools that are easy to implement, so it's kind of like preemptive in a way. We're going to give you something that's easy to use so that you don't get depleted. But then you could also think about, well, because a lot of what we give people as tools are actually pretty depleting to use, right? The kind of therapy tools, or let's say even like mental performance coaching tools or whatever, like a lot of them are hard, you know, like cognitively, and they're cognitively demanding. And we're always like giving people advice that's like on the face of it good, but it's actually pretty complicated. So what we've done is we've been thinking more about like how can we make things like super easy for people to do rather than thinking about replenishing per se. But I've started to think more replenishment, kind of with exercise, et cetera, and things like that, movement that we can talk about in a sec. Um, but I think the way we've gone so far is to say, okay, the issue at hand really is we actually don't want to load folks with anxiety up too much with hard things to multitask with, right? So if they're coming in and they're saying, "Hey, I'm anxious about, test taking, or I have these distracting panicky feelings sometimes in my chest and I get hot," rather than saying, "Okay, I don't know, let's do cognitive reappraisal or cognitive therapy." I do some of that, sure, but what's been frustrating is how hard that is for people to do over time. Is, we give them this task of like, well, reinterpret that feeling as not harmful, and try to practice that over time. Or reinterpret neutral faces like what you're seeing in front of you right now is actually somebody's paying attention to you and really engaged rather than bored and, thinking you're an idiot. And that's all fine, and those strategies can be helpful. But I think what we're learning over and over is because people with anxiety are already taxed, and this goes for people with depression, OCD, trauma, for the most part, is that they're already taxed. And if you look at their frontal cortex and these other systems that are reflective of kind of what their core capacity is, to pay attention and be in the moment, they're taxed already. We know that. In lots of different ways. Brain activity looks like it's decreased, or certain parts of the brain have decreased, gray matter, or just less efficiency in the system. And so we know there are deficits in frontal brain capacity for a lot of people with anxiety. So why do we keep giving them things that are super hard? Forget about it. What about mindfulness? Everybody wants to do mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is amazing. Blah blah blah. Sure, but you know how many Westerners know how to do mindfulness well or quickly? Very few, right? It's not baked into our culture. And so teaching people to do mindfulness sounds great on the face of it, but so few people actually carry through with it, and they find it difficult to implement. Not only do they find it difficult to find 5 or 10 minutes a day to sit on a cushion and do some meditation, but they also don't quite exactly know what the heck you mean when you say, hey, be mindful when you wash the dishes, or be mindful when you're grilling outside, or while you're vacuuming, or whatever you're doing. So a lot of the data we've collected and we've seen in the literature, as well as like all of these different strategies, are like drawing on these cognitive systems that are already sapped in people with anxiety. Why are we doing that? So one thing that we've done is use a strategy called distance self-talk, or third person self-talk, which sounds really kind of goofy on the face of it, but it's really effective, and it's not difficult to do at all. And we've shown in some neuroimaging studies and some behavioral and kind of like social situation sort of studies that um, if you talk to yourself in the third person about how you're feeling, you can do that really quickly without using frontal brain systems, and it kind of naturally leads you to give yourself advice and do the reappraisal, so to speak, as if you were talking to a friend. And so what we've shown is, if you say, okay, hey Jason, Jason's looking at Tony's face, and he's here, he's like, you know um Jason is nervous about what he thinks, and Jason's worried that he's going to think he's weird, and you can say that, but then you say, well, Jason knows that he's done these sorts of things before. It's fine. They're going to get along just fine. It's all good. Um, that what we find is the more you're able to reflect on, and this goes for like present moment, past, and future. If you reflect on like a breakup, or you think about something in the future, as Jason's worried about this flight he has to take to Spain. He doesn't like flying very much, and he's worried about the turbulence. But Jason knows that air travel is very safe, and he's been on thousands of flights and thousands of hours. It's going to be fine. And so what we've found through all these studies is that people with anxiety and depression, they can use these strategies. They're not difficult. They don't use, it's not harder for them to do it. The brain activity does not require frontal brain activity. Instead, it's kind of like a switch in the medial prefrontal cortex, like ACC sort of area, where it kind of switches your brain automatically and to start thinking about yourself as somebody else. So like another Jason. So it's as if I'm talking to another Jason and saying, hey, Jason, you know, you can do this. And so we've done that, and we're doing a treatment study right now with people with anxiety and depression, to see if we can train them to do this strategy more routinely in their everyday life, and it helps with symptoms. But we've done it in the lab. It's effective. We've shown that it's effortless, more or less. And um, it's it's something that doesn't require them to do that much, and it's not depleting in and of itself, and so that's why we like it. That's one example. We have a couple of other examples of things, of other strategies that we've been using that feel less effortful. But that's just one example of, okay, we can go back to the kind of like, well, how can you replenish? But the kind of strategy we've taken is to say, look at all these things that are so effortful for people to do. How can we make them less effortful, and maybe even effortless for them to apply in their daily lives?
Yeah, essentially reducing the noise, right? Like with when you work with people with autism, a lot of the emotional empathy that they don't have, and all the issues that they have with conversations and looking people in the eye. A lot of it is just that they're inundated with so much noise and so many things they have to pay attention to that they just don't know where to look or how to respond or any of that. And by them closing their eyes or them looking down, they're able to reduce the noise and
Hmm.
listen better and pay better attention. And there's research to support the idea of like, not looking someone in the eyes, looking off in space allows you to be a better listener as opposed to just trying to focus on, oh, did this
Right.
land when I said it, or are they paying attention, or any of these things that as a professor, when you teach a class for the first time, you're constantly judging whether or not you're doing a good job by staring at the
Hmm.
student's face. And over time, you learn to just not pay as much of attention to it. So essentially, you're just reducing the noise in a very effortless way, which, like you said, it makes a ton of sense to be able to do that. Working with the students that I have, a lot of times they'll have test anxiety, and telling them, hey, like, what was your GPA last semester? Oh, you did 4.0. So what in your past would indicate that you're going to struggle with your test today? And just by shifting that mindset allows them to be like, yeah, you know what, like, I've studied, I've done the work. Previous tests have shown that I've gotten A's, so I shouldn't have to worry about today. And it is very simple to do and to teach. One of the studies that we just completed in our lab was we were using cognitive reappraisal during exercise, and one group was doing cognitive reappraisal, the other group was getting motivation as normal. And we just taught them simple things of, if you get bored. They were doing it on a stationary bike, so you can imagine the level of boredom that comes with that.
Hmm.
They were blinded to everything but just the power output. So we told them, hey, if boredom comes up, try to reframe that as like a challenge. How can you push through it? If your legs
Hmm.
start to burn, try to reshift that towards the more they burn, the better you're going to adapt. The bigger your muscles, the better you're going to get. All those simple things. And what we found was they were able to improve in performance compared to the control group. And then we did a 3 and 6 week follow up, and the group that had cognitive reappraisal didn't show any differences in PALMS or Beck depression inventory or the Breck motivational test. But 6 weeks afterwards, the cognitive reappraisal group outperformed the control group in all those categories, showing kind of like just that 1 week of practice that we did on the test. They were able to take that into their real life situations. So what
Mm.
they learned in a week was able to show 6 weeks later to improve mood, depression scores, and motivation. And just those emotion
Nice.
regulation strategies are so easy to teach. I think it took us, I don't know, 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes of their warm up to teach them it. And then we just kind
Yeah.
of reiterated it through the intervention. And yeah, it was one of those things where we also saw better HRV response. So they had better
Mm.
sympathetic arousal and bringing it back down the parasympathetic arousal than the control group. So they were able to push themselves further, but then also bring themselves back down just by
Hmm.
using cognitive reappraisal strategies, which was very, very cool to see. But it goes to the point
Yeah.
that you're making of like, yeah, these simple strategies can be huge with people if they're taught correctly, and if they like you said, it can't be something that they have to spend 30 minutes a day doing, or else they're not going to do it, right? Because then that could
Yeah.
cause more depletion. So that is very interesting that you're finding that with the anxiety stuff. How you're talking about it makes me think that kids that are anxious could possibly be getting over prescribed for ADHD. Because wouldn't those kind of be the same thing where they have a hard time controlling their focus? Do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Something that I am constantly fumbling into more and more. I was never an ADHD person, and I'm very much a cognitive person. So it's just interesting studying anxiety and being kind of like relatively, in a sense, being more interested in anxiety in cognition. Even though I'm very much interested in emotion, I kind of come at it from more of like a cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience bent. Um, anyway, so I continue to grapple with the overlap between anxiety and attention deficit type disorders, ADHD, attentional problems, whatever it is. Because yes, we all kind of land on the same thing, which is like, oh, what we're seeing is that it's hard for people to pay attention. Sometimes you see that, you see it in the test results. They can't perform, or they're distracted so much that they can't actually show up to class for whatever reason. And what's been really fascinating, not only for kids, but kind of where I started was with undergraduates, is the number of times we have undergraduates coming into our clinic for a test. They want like a kind of IQ and achievement test, basically, or a cognitive test to get accommodations for class. They all come in saying, I have ADHD. Can I get a diagnosis so I can get accommodations? And then maybe I'll go and get prescribed Adderall or whatever. 90% of those, this might be a little exaggeration, but let's say it's like 75% of those students coming in thinking they have ADHD and wanting an ADHD diagnosis leave with an anxiety diagnosis.
Mm.
So what's interesting is when you get to kind of adulthood, which is where I started a lot of my career, I've done more and more kid stuff over time, but where I started was much more focusing on adults, is that as adults, what we're seeing more is that people are distractible, are having difficulties with controlling attention. It's mostly due to anxiety, stress. They're distracted. They're going to their phone. They're doing other things. They're kind of all over the place. We see it more as an anxiety problem, because ADHD is really something that for most people should have started when they were really little. They likely would have had a diagnosis early. Sure, there are plenty of kids who go undiagnosed, but if you make it all the way to college and you're a decent performing student, maybe not as well as you want, it's kind of hard to say you likely have ADHD. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen, but a lot of the time what ends up happening is those are students with anxiety. So that was one thing that would just like always come up. And so as I've gotten more into working with kid populations, we are actually seeing quite a bit of overlap. And some of these kids do have ADHD as a pure diagnosis, and some have anxiety, and some have comorbid. Now, I'm still of the mind, I don't quite know whether the high comorbidity, which in some ways can be like 50-60% between child ADHD and child anxiety, that seems like too high for me to be like, these are different things. They're probably similar things. And with the kind of, I know well how hard it is to do a good diagnosis, and a lot of people do not get great diagnostics. That and not to mention that the symptoms in the diagnostic manual are quite overlapping between these two things. And if it's not ADHD hyperactive type or even combined type, if it's ADHD inattentive type, it's hard to argue that there's not a ton of overlap just phenomenologically with anxiety, because so many of the things kind of end up overlapping. You try to like tease out what came first, right? Was it that they were a little inattentive and then that made them anxious over time because they started to not do well and then they get anxious and hyper focus on themselves? Or was it that they were anxious and they became inattentive? And that's harder to grapple with. But what we've started to do with some of the treatments and models we're developing for kid anxiety is like, look, if you look across all the literature and you try to say, like, what are the core deficits or core challenges for people with, or the core challenge with people with mental health concerns or psychopathology, attention is a huge piece of it, right? Like you just look across like everything, whether you're talking about anxiety, ADHD, conduct problems, schizophrenia, depression, PTSD and trauma, OCD, you name it. Attentional difficulties are pretty core.
Mhm.
And so, or cognitive control, if you want to kind of, expand it and say that it's a difficulty in controlling and adapting attention over time, which somebody might call cognitive control, which is, can you stay focused? And when you're distracted, can you bring it back, sort of thing. This kind of notion of attention and cognitive control, there's a lot of slippery overlap there too, in terms of just the concepts. So what we started to do is actually we say, well, what we could do then is just build core capacity for cognitive, effortful control, attentional control early in kids with anxiety and ADHD, or ADHD. And maybe that's where we need to start, is just kind of like a lot of what I'm interested in is just kind of like developing core capacity for control, for attention, or at least making it easier for people to maybe draw on a reserve of attention and cognitive control. And so that's how I've seen it overlap. So like I don't need it to be called any diagnosis. Like, I don't it doesn't necessarily concern me that it's this, that, or it's exactly anxiety, or it's exactly ADHD, or is it first anxiety, whatever. These things have core challenges which are around focusing, maintaining, and adapting attention and cognition over time. And I think if we kind of focus in on that as one core capacity to build up, to train, to treat early on, I think you could have a lot of impacts on a lot of mental health problems over the full arc of development.
What does that look like for those adolescent populations as far as the tools that you're giving them? Because I would have to imagine, as over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a reduction in physical activity, an
Yeah.
increase in ultra processed foods. So I would
Yeah.
have to imagine that plays a huge role in their ability to maintain attention, because they just have so much energy that they're not able to expend. So they're constantly trying to pull attention otherwise. And I know you
Mm.
also studied sex differences as well, and we can talk about that afterwards. But we're like, what are some of the tools that you're giving these kids within the research that you're seeing to build good efficacy?
Yeah, and in terms of, we're just starting to do some exercise actually, but we haven't thought a lot about um, diet necessarily or nutrition directly. It's totally, it's totally related. Going to make it, going to be important. We've started to focus more on the kind of physical activity part. Not to mention, we haven't even mentioned the big elephant in the room, right? Social media, multimedia use, like as another core distractor that's kind of more omnipresent than ever. But what we've done is actually, even in little kids, so you were talking about adolescents, I'm talking about like 4 and 5 year olds. So if we can start super early, because people do get diagnosed with anxiety and ADHD and all sorts of things at 4 or 5 years old, right? ADHD, you kind of have to, kind of definitionally, to get diagnosed with ADHD, you have to see those sort of problems that early. So we've actually been developing and testing out. We just finished a pilot randomized control trial with little kiddos with various anxiety disorders, who could also have ADHD or ODD. Many of them did have ADHD. ODD is oppositional defiant disorder, kind of just more distractible and impulsive. Not kids who are really going to make uh, a real mess of our environment because we were doing group treatment, but kids who were more, oppositional to instructions from adults. We kind of let them in, but ADHD was kind of the core additional diagnosis we let in. And what we basically did is we built a camp style treatment, group treatment. So we would have about 6 kids at a time come into the lab. They would each be assigned a counselor. And that counselor was a paraprofessional, really. So an undergraduate or a recent postgraduate with a BA level or a BS degree. And they would be matched with an individual counselor. And then there was kind of one camp leader who was a graduate student in our case, who would kind of direct the whole camp. But it was basically like 3 hours, 5 Saturdays in a row, across the summer many times. Sometimes we could get them going in the fall too, but we did it a lot of times over the summer as kind of a camp. Um, and what we did in the camp is we basically like tried to develop core capacity for cognitive control, attention, effortful control, these different terms that are interchangeable, where we had them playing games that we knew would exercise these frontal brain regions. So even, and simple games like red light, green light, we had them solving puzzles, on purpose. We had them do, um, you know, blow up the balloon to a certain level or pop the balloon. We had a bunch of different games, Simon Says, stuff like that. All sorts of games that were specifically chosen that would kind of exercise, so to speak, you know, um, focus, impulse control, inhibitory control, flexibility in their thinking. We had some of them do like different, like I said, puzzles. And so we did that for 5 weeks. And our control group was just kind of like free play. We just had the kids do kind of whatever they wanted. And then the parents were supposed to play either these kind of cognitive control games at home with the kids or just spend more special time. And while everybody kind of got better over time, which was nice to see, what we did see with the kind of cognitive control training games group is they actually got a little even more better over time in their anxiety symptoms. Their capacity for effortful control did kind of change a bit. Some of that might be practice, which is actually okay with us. But we're seeing that for sure, this approach, which is to kind of engage kids in a group format that's fun in play, but specifically choosing play type games where they're exercising their frontal brain regions can have downstream effects on their anxiety. So this is what we're trying to do, is kind of like build that capacity through fun, through games, through an engaging environment, and then something they can translate to home with their families. And so I think the earlier we can get them, the better. And so that's what we've started to do with little kids. But for sure, I think incorporating more physical activity is another way to go, that I'm interested in doing, and figuring out exactly what it is about physical activity that can be helpful for people with anxiety and depression. But that's kind of where we've started with the little kiddos, is building that capacity through games that we know will work on frontal control brain regions.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So it's just organized play essentially, right? Trying to get them
Yeah,
to.
it's organized play with a focus on choosing games or different activities that they can play individually with their counselor and cooperatively with some of their campmates, that we have pretty good evidence that are building capacity for these core functions of cognitive control that we know are important.
And the other group, did they have counselors with them as well?
Yeah,
Did they have the
they
same
did.
amount of attention? Okay.
Same format. It's just that the counselor didn't tell them anything to do. They just said, "What do you want to do? Here are a bunch of blocks. Here's some coloring books. Here's some rocks. You tell me how you want to play, and I'll follow your lead." Whereas in our kind of Camp Kid Power, we called it, these effortful control games, we had a script and we had a number of games in the way that we played with them, and we titrated up the difficulty of it at times. The red light, green light, faster or slower sort of thing. And so they both had the same amount of attention. One was just given, games that we felt were exercising that muscle in their brain we were hoping to increase.
Yeah, and I like that idea of having it just be incrementally more adaptable, a little bit more
Uh-huh.
challenging, right? Because then that's going to keep them engaged and intrigued
Yeah.
with it. And it's also going to force them to adapt. Just like in exercise, you have to progressively overload in order for you to have adaptations. You're going to do the same thing with the brain, and doing that at that age when where they're extremely malleable, and plastic
Right.
makes a ton of sense. Why do you think has this always been an issue, anxiety within this age range, or is this just something that has come about over the last 10, 20 years?
No, we've known that there are little anxious kiddos out there for a long time, and oftentimes what happens is they don't present to treatment. They're underdiagnosed in large part because the interference that a lot of them are experiencing. Parents at that age, I think a lot of parents are confused or conflicted about like what to do with a kid that young, and we know that they present kind of out in the world, but we haven't done actually a lot of research on them. So I don't think this is a new phenomenon per se. I just think we have to pay more attention to it because there just hasn't been a lot of research focused on it for reasons you might imagine. Like those little stinkers run all over the place. Their lives are complicated. Some of the parents have them at home, some of them have them in at a preschool or a something like that. So I think it's just an age population that has not yet really been reached. But we know that most people with anxiety disorders who have anxiety disorders as adults were diagnosed pretty darn early. And the earlier you can detect these things, the more chance you have at change and recovery, and actually preventing kind of full blown disorders that interfere with people's lives for decades. So I would say it's more of just like an understudied and untapped population that we know has kind of been there.
Yeah, and then with the anxiety disorders, there's a lot of subcategories. Do they present
Mhm.
differently as they age? Like, do they present with the same social anxiety that a teenager you would assume would present as, with the thought of like people are judging me, everyone's looking at me, I'm the center of everyone's attention, right? Versus
Yeah.
kids at that age, I would assume that maybe that's not as prevalent. So does it change over time, or is it the same kind of anxiety presenting itself throughout the lifetime?
Yeah, I mean, I think social anxiety is a good example because that's pretty well preserved across the lifespan. Is like basically little kiddos with anxiety are anxious about social situations for like the same sort of reasons they might be anxious later. Sure, it gets more complex, and the scenarios and the and the consequences they're thinking about are get more involved, but it's still pretty core that like I'm nervous these people aren't going to like me and I'm going to be ostracized basically and I'm going to be alone essentially. Like that's the core of social anxiety at any age. What is kind of more interesting is that something like separation anxiety is quite common. That's probably the most prevalent of the anxiety disorders in kiddos. Whereas you don't see separation anxiety in adults as much, although the DSM has changed and there are a lot more adults who are being diagnosed with separation anxiety in ways, especially like with their partners and things like that. Maybe not with parents per se, but more with like caregivers or loved ones or partners, or, their spouses. But that's where you see the biggest difference, I would say, is you see that separation anxiety disorder has generally been kind of like a kid specific disorder. That you don't necessarily see play out in adulthood. But whether it's separation is pretty common. The next is social anxiety, and that kind of looks similar-ish. And then generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, that can start really early as kiddos, and that kind of looks the same too. It's like they're worried about a lot of stuff. They're worried about their parents' health. They're worried about maybe their own health. They're worried about the how well things are going at school. They're worried about, whether some other bad random thing they think might happen is going to happen. They might be worried about storms, so they're worried about a lot of different things, which is very similar to what happens with people with, adults with GAD. It's just like the content might shift a little bit, just like with social anxiety, the content might shift a little bit, but the core ideas are still the same.
Yeah. Could separation anxiety in adulthood look like codependency? I would have to imagine
Yeah,
it to be
totally.
very
Yeah, I mean,
similar.
something like that.
Yeah.
What we have for adults is we have dependent personality disorder, which has been in the DSM for forever. And that has always been seen as almost like it's codependency, but almost like a severe version of social anxiety. But now I think people are kind of reconceptualizing it as maybe that's kind of what adult separation anxiety disorder might look like. So, excuse me, I think we're evolving as we're just seeing that. I think what's been interesting for me over time has been, we think of things as so much like this is a disorder of childhood, this is a disorder of adulthood. Like we were just talking about ADHD, for example. Take that. So many people just thought ADHD is a kid disorder, and nobody really paid attention to like where do all these ADHD kids go, right? Like we don't send them off to an island somewhere. Like they're in, they're all around us, and now all of a sudden we have a surge in the prevalence in adult ADHD. It's actually like, well, no, we don't. It's just nobody's been looking. Everybody just forgot that those kids grow up, and sure, many of them are on Adderall, but like some are not on Adderall for life. I don't think that's a great idea anyway, and many have been living with it and struggling with it their whole lives, and we just haven't paid as close attention.
Yeah. Do we know correlationally or foundationally, like what is causing this anxiety to progress or to happen in young kids? Like my thought process is that research by Robert Sapolsky, where they're looking at cortisol levels in utero of moms, typically those babies have a enlarged amygdala and a small prefrontal cortex, and that's something that is due to the cortisol response and glucocorticoids and all that in birth, which obviously gives them a disadvantage as they continue to grow, which a lot of violent criminal offenders have small prefrontal cortex, large amygdalas. Is there something foundationally like that that is happening with anxious people, or is there correlations to maybe socioeconomic status, maybe single parent households, things like that, that could be foundationally building this anxious group of people?
Yeah, I mean, as you know as well as I do, that these are multifactorial, problems, and so I think we have a reasonable amount of evidence that if you pack in, genetic loading from a parent or parents or relatives with anxiety already on board, if you pack in stress during pregnancy, if you pack in stress during the birth process, or complications during the birth process, if you add in right low socioeconomic status or just under resourced in early childhood, bullying, other bad, trauma, other, unexpected bad things happening, a family member losing a job and then having to move or whatever. That we know a lot of packing in uncertainty and some of these early risk factors around stress that might be mediated by, cortisol or glucocorticoids or other infections, maybe. Um, that affect brain development, that we know a lot of those things are packed in there along with genetics. I kind of, along those lines, I generally think of Dave Barlow, who's one of my favorites in the anxiety world, who's developed most of the evidence, many of the evidence-based treatments for anxiety and depression. He's got this kind of like three-factor model of anxiety and depression, or negative affective psychopathology development, which is like, hey, people are born with some sort of vulnerability factors, let's call them, like some of these things we are just talking about, whether it's genetic or early in utero or at birth complications or increases in stress mediated um, uh, chemicals or what have you. So they're on, that's kind of what they're loaded with. And then if some other environmental stressors happen pretty early, then you're kind of like you're set on a path to probably develop some stress or anxiety related disorder, right? Then in terms of like which one you get, it's probably shaped by additional unique environmental factors that put you in one direction or the other. Let's say I've worked with people who have fear of vomiting before, called emetophobia. The one woman I worked with, she had anxious relatives in her family. She was, early life, maybe she had some stressors, and she was also taught, this is the other piece of the puzzle we were talking about, emotion regulation, is people are often taught poor emotion regulation strategies from their caregivers early on. And the major one is just like avoidance of expressing emotion and managing emotion, right? Like keep that to yourself. And so if you're learning all that, and then she just so happened to be in an elementary school class one day, and a friend of hers who was sick turned around and like vomited on the floor right beside her, and boom, all of a sudden that's what she struggles with now is fear of vomiting, or she did until I treated her. But that's kind of the way I think about it, is like we have these vulnerability factors that we're going to keep digging into and trying to figure out, but like there's a lot in there that I think is just it's just going to be challenging to like pinpoint anything. Like big amygdala, small prefrontal cortex, like maybe, but there's a lot more to the story, right? So there are these biological vulnerabilities, some of which we have some sense of, but I think if you start thinking about it in a broader context, like yeah, there's some vulnerabilities, then they have stressors early in life, and they're taught poor emotion regulation strategies, which generally has to do with like emotional avoidance. And then they have some unique experiences in their life that shapes the way that they feel about certain situations, whether it's social situations or it's vomiting, or let's say it's dirt and germs in general. And then you get OCD because you have, you get sick one day from, touching a doorknob or whatever. I think that's kind of how I generally think about these things. And so there are early enough signs for kiddos, and that the earlier we intervene and the earlier we kind of correct in a way these poor emotion regulation strategies, we can kind of protect against any of those additional unique experiences they might have that might shape a specific anxiety disorder or a set of anxiety disorders.
Yeah. So with the idea of being able to control some of these symptoms, and we talked about exercise being one of these ways that we could do that. Some of the research shows that like high intensity interval training is a
Mm.
great way to help people with anxiety control their anxiety symptoms. The idea is if you can take someone through high intensity interval training, they're going to have very much the same symptoms as an anxiety attack would have, of being able to not control their breathing, having these anxious thoughts of this is hard, when's it going to be over? Have you seen anything along those lines that would indicate that that is an appropriate intervention? Because we also see like moderate exercise is great for depression. So is there certain exercise interventions that you found to be more impactful for certain disorders?
That's literally what my student Keenan Sayers and I are really trying to figure out. So Keenan came to me from North Carolina. He's got a dual degree in psychology and exercise science and physiology. And I've over the past, since the pandemic, I've started to kind of get back into running. I used to run when I was in high school, and then I got off it. And so I'm doing like half marathons and trying to do more marathons. And so I've gotten really into kind of like sports psychology from my own personal experience. And what I think what we're seeing, I think, is that there are definitely ways, there are some general principles of exercise that I think have anxiolytic effects. And then I think there are some specific types of exercise regimens that might work better for certain populations. I don't think we have great data on that now. And that's why it's kind of frustrating. On the one hand, it's like, hey, everybody should get out and exercise. Which in a way is like, well, no shit. Everybody should get out to exercise for all sorts of reasons, right? Like for health, for weight loss, for um, exposure to nature, even if you can get outside, all sorts of benefits of movement of the body, whether it's yoga or running or hit exercises. So I'm a little frustrated that we don't have more answers of like specifically how to like tailor that stuff, but we do know physical activity is generally good for emotion, cognition, and things that matter for psychopathology. Um, but Keenan and I just finished up for his master's thesis, kind of alluded, getting back to one of the conditions you alluded to, which is he's interested in something called anxiety sensitivity, which is more or less panic panic disorder sort of symptoms, which is you're afraid of your own internal bodily sensations. Now, anxiety sensitivity is also about some other aspects of like you feel like you might be going crazy and that bothers you, or you're concerned about how other people might perceive your physical appearance when you might be anxious, like you have red cheeks or something. But Keenan and I were like specifically going in with it. It's like, okay, for people who have high anxiety sensitivity or like basically fear of their own internal sensations, which is what panic is all about, is like your heart starts to flutter and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to have a heart attack. We said, let's have those people come in and let's have them just moderately jog on the treadmill. But what we were really interested in was we were curious, does running and getting up to that moderate intensity, does it actually make people start to think about having a heart attack? Because it mimics a panic like symptoms. That's the whole idea. And then are they able to reinterpret that to get through it? And so we then did an emotion regulation task with them right after, yeah, before and after they exercise, actually. I'm trying to remember the study. It's just finished and we're writing it up and I can't keep them all straight sometimes. But we did this emotion regulation test before and after they exercised, or before and after they just rested on the treadmill. And basically, we were just asking the question: do people get better at reappraising um, after they've exercised? With the notion that if you are able to push through an exercise regimen that kind of feels like it's inducing the symptoms you're worried about, do you get better at reappraising? So we just finished the results, analyzing the results, and it's kind of interesting what seems to happen. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the task we used. We used an EEG task where we showed people who have panicky type symptoms. We showed them images of people who looked like they were having a panic attack, like they showed them images of like or doubled over or looking crazy or whatever, looking like they're feeling like they're out of control. um, and so we showed them these images and we asked them to either look at them passively, or we also asked them in a different block. We said, hey, look at this image and think about overcoming it. That it's like, this person's having this experience, I might share that experience, but like this too shall pass. I can deal with this. I'll be able to get over it. And what we noticed was after they exercised, and this was more so than after they exercised relative to when they rested, is they actually, when they just looked at those pictures, not even trying to reappraise on purpose, when they looked at the pictures, they actually had less of emotional response than what they did before they exercised. And what we saw in the EEG components when they reappraised, we actually saw that it seemed like they were actually paying more attention to the picture than they were before exercise. So it looked kind of like they were more willing in a way. This was completely backwards to what we expected. I'm just going to put it out there.
Yeah.
In terms of the reappraisal findings, for the passive viewing findings, that was actually what we thought would happen, is after you exercise, you just kind of have less of an emotional reaction to these same kind of scary looking panicky pictures. And that is what happened. But during reappraisal, they actually had the bigger brain signal to these negative looking panicky images. And we thought they were going to have a smaller one, because we thought, oh, they'd be able to reappraise it and it would be even easier to get past it. But instead, it looks like they were actually paying more attention to it and engaging more with it. That was greater than what they did before exercising. So we're trying to figure out, we have that study. We have another study with trauma survivors who we also had come in and do a reappraisal task. and exercise on the treadmill in between. And the findings are just kind of more complicated than we thought, but it seems that like exercise is definitely enhancing people's ability to kind of like maybe implicitly let emotions wash over them, and also giving them more cognitive capacity to think through something that looks or feels scary. Which I think on the face of it does make some intuitive sense, which is like, you know, after exercise, we do know that exercise boosts cognition, right? You have better focus, you have more attentional capacity, and so we think like what exercise might be doing is helping people focus more on things that they find scary, and also being able to let them go then when they're given the option to also just kind of like have your own natural reaction to the image. So this is all to say that we're using the treadmill as one way to do some of these studies. We haven't like pinpointed anything in particular. We tried to do this with this panic study, which was kind of the original rationale. But what Keen and I have done since then is really tried to kind of bring the literature together and try to really figure out, are there multiple pathways for different types of disorders? So like with panic disorder, people with anxiety who are concerned about physiologic sensations, does cardiovascular exercise, well, maybe it's hit because you can ratchet up the intensity, or maybe it's moderate to higher intensity running, whatever it is, does that sort of exercise work better for people who have that sort of anxiety? Maybe strength training is really important. We've done some work with this and some hypothesizing around this. Maybe strength training is actually super important for trauma survivors, and maybe in particular for trauma survivors who are females of survivors of sexual assault. That it fits more into a narrative of building back, capacity, and we know that when folks are traumatized and when females are sexually assaulted, we know they tend to have beliefs that the world is dangerous and that they might fall apart and they can't handle it anymore. What if we give them back that empowerment by having them do strength training, for instance? I think there are lots of opportunities like that. I think for depression, for instance, maybe strength training is also good for depression, because we know for depression, overcoming anhedonia and kind of feeling more um, accomplished and mastery is actually a really important piece of recovering from depression. And what a treatment that's been out there for decades called behavioral activation actually helps people with depression do is like feel more mastery and accomplishment over that. Maybe strength training, maybe any sort of exercise is fine for depression. But I think that question that you asked is really important and critical, because we don't know whether there's a matching we should be doing. But Keenan and I have been starting to develop this model based on some of the findings we have and a review of the literature, that maybe there are ways to think about what different types of exercise has effects on these core systems of like cognition, um, avoidance motivation, approach motivation, and how that might relate to anxiety and depression differentially. I think there's a huge upside and possibility to look into that more, but we don't have the answers to that right now.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely my read of the literature, with the idea of moderate intensity exercise seems to be aerobic moderate intensity exercise seems to be more beneficial for people with depression, maybe not as much with people with anxiety, and a lot of that comes down to BDNF is one of the big hypothesis of brain derived neurotrophic factor being
Yeah.
released to help improve synaptic plasticity, and that comes from moderate intensity at a dose dependent dose response rate as well, which is very interesting. The more you do, the bigger the release seems to be important
Mm.
as well. But yeah, the idea that, at least from what I've read, that the prefrontal cortex gets a lot more oxygen and blood flowing through it, and the connectivity, the white matter tracks from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex seems to be strengthened in people after aerobic exercise, which helps them with decision making, fear response, and things along those lines. We've seen that with females doing exercise as well. Within the research, they did reactivity, reaction times, and EEG signaling. And the females that did exercise actually improved their reaction time and decreased their attention to negative stimuli after the intervention. So those things have different impacts depending on what issues you're having, what what you're currently going through. And I think it is important to kind of standardize that. Me and Damon just wrote a paper on the idea of trying to standardize protocols and how we measure exercise to make sure that we get the most
Yeah.
accurate measures of those things. And it's difficult to do. The idea of I think the restrictions of academia makes it hard to create a program that will help, because you have to have like progressive overload. You have to have all these things that we talked about with the kids. Like they have to be challenged throughout. So how do you create a program that's, 8 to 12 weeks to 16 weeks that is individualized for each person? Like you just can't do that within the research. And I don't know if that's something that we'll ever be able to overcome, because a lot of the research that I've seen is very much standardized to this idea of you're either doing 30 minutes 3 days a week. There's no progressive overload, and then after 8 weeks, you look at the results. And my immediate train of thought goes, that's really boring. So having people that have
Yeah.
depression be like, hey, we're going to do some really boring, mundane exercise, you're
Yeah.
not going to get them to want to do it, right? So what I look at is like, how do we get people to adhere to exercise and enjoy exercise? How do we get
Hmm.
them motivated to do exercise
Right.
as well? Is that something that you guys are also looking at, trying to combine maybe some CBT type stuff to improve motivation along with exercise? Is that maybe something that you're looking for next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're thinking about a lot of things along the same lines that
Yeah.
you guys are, and we could spend another 5 hours just talking about that. But I'm part. I'll go back just for a minute to link it back to I love exercise. I do a lot of it. I enjoy running quite a bit, and I like going to the gym and doing some weight training here and there. I like pickleball, all this stuff. My frustration with exercise is the same frustration I have with therapy and the types of therapies we have is like a lot of people don't want to do it,
Yeah.
right? And people find it too hard. And so I continue to struggle with like how can we make these things easier? How can we make people motivated to do these things? Is it matching the exercise to the person? I completely agree with you that the protocols that are in the literature are super boring. And so I've started to think about, well, look, there's so much content out there, right? Like Peloton's got billions of exercise programs and exercise classes. Apple Fitness Plus has introduced a ton more themselves. There are so many different ones out there that already exist. And within the research domain, I think what we could do is borrow those,
Mhm.
and there's nothing stopping us from saying, hey, I'm going to take Kelly's 12 Peloton rides, let's say, who's on Peloton, and I'm going to use her 12 Peloton ride. I'm going to pick three of her hits, three of her endurance sessions, and whatever. And I'm going to build a program basically built on content that already exists that's way more engaging and way more fun than any of the stupid stuff that we do in the lab. But I'm going to do that systematically. I'm going to give that to people, and I'm going to have another, whatever we've thought about. I bought a Peloton treadmill for the lab recently, precisely for this purpose,
Mhm.
which was like, why don't we just use the content that already exists and lots of people can access already, and test it out? We have no clue whether these things are better or worse or whatever, and then like compare it to a business as usual sort of thing. And so I think there are ways to become more naturalistic in what we're doing by leaning on the content that already exists, or borrowing the elements from the content that we know is out there that's really interesting and creating some of our own that's actually not boring. And so I think there are opportunities that we can take by either borrowing content or partnering with proprietary, and industry to work together to do studies. So that's a piece of what we're trying to think about doing is like there's so many things we could actually just use. Nike running, Nike fitness, Nike, those are free. Those are just out. That's like super accessible. And they have a lot of great, trainers who are on there who talk to you on your headphones and stuff. Like, why aren't we using that to treat depression rather than something that we just create that, again, it can be standardized enough because you can give these same things to people and they can take them home anyway. So I
Yeah.
think that's one missed opportunity so far is I think we should just be using some of this amazing content that's out there to just make it more engaging. And I think experimentally, there's no real major drawback to that if we do it within the if we create things that are still time limited and consistent across people. I think we can do it. Um, the other thing that I do think is going to be really interesting, and so that's part of me try to think like, can we make exercise more accessible and more interesting to people? Because I think the sort of exercise that we might rig up in the lab is not going to be terribly interesting to people.
Right.
And so like we got to figure out ways to engage. I think group activities are always a way to get people to do more exercise. You probably know about more about this than I do, but in talking to my kinesiology pals, doing things as a group is always more effective. And so like I think we got to lean into like forget the one-off sort of exercise. Like we should think about getting people into groups and testing it that way. Again, more naturalistic experiments that I think are still totally legitimate and we should have out there. And then I do think, in my view, I really do believe the $1 million question slash research approach and agenda would be, let's start marrying movement with psychological skills.
Yeah.
And so we already know from the sports domain, right? They already do that, right? So like there's a whole other field that I've become much more interested in, sports psychology, where there's like all these psychological skills people are already using to help with performance, but they're the same skills basically that we teach our clients in therapy.
Right.
It's just that the context is slightly different. They're telling people to use these same sort of, whether it's mindfulness or attentional focus to positive things or positive self statements or reframing, same sort of skills. They're just using it in a very specific context, which is around performance and around sport performance, to motivate and reduce the noise and reduce the distraction. And so everything seems so compatible to me. So at the end of the day, I think what could be very therapeutic for people who are not necessarily engaged in sport, but they want to leverage the benefits we know of exercise and physical activity, and then psychological skills that we teach in all sorts of different contexts, whether it's in mental fitness performance, mental fitness, or in therapy. Is I do think there's this opportunity, and I don't know if you know about this hypothesis. You probably do, and I always screw it up, but it's one of my favorites that I haven't quite tested, but I want to. Is the cross stressor adaptation hypothesis. My student Chris Webster introduced this to me years ago when he was one of the first students I did. I have three students who are doing a joint psychology kinesiology, clinical psychology kinesiology degree, because we're really interested in merging these worlds. Is that if you're able to, let's say we did an experiment during COVID and Chris still hasn't published it. I got to get it out there.
Yeah.
But the idea with this cross stressor adaptation idea is, what if we ask people to run or to do strength training or do HIIT, and while they're doing it, engage in psychological skills similar to what you were saying around the focus being on the performance and the pain of the performance. But what if we actually like have them exercise across even one session or multiple sessions, where some of the sessions we have them focus on using those psychological skills to improve performance of the exercise or to adapt to the performance of the exercise? What if we do that, but maybe in some other sessions we actually have them continue doing the exercise, but now we have them work through a psychological problem they're dealing with, their depression, their anxiety, their social anxiety. What if we have them do that? And what if we bridge these worlds such that you can kind of work through psychological problems, not just the pain and the fatigue of exercising, but also the psychological pain and fatigue around life during movement, to kind of piggyback and bootstrap the benefits of movement in these various ways. And I think that's where the action's at. And there hasn't been enough of those studies done out there, where you're using reappraisal or mindfulness or whatever other strategy that we can stick into an exercise regimen to not only overcome the difficulties of exercise, but the difficulties of life. I think that's like where I think there's a huge upside there for us to explore.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. As a veteran myself, I tend to look at like what a lot of the veterans are doing with therapy and stuff like that, and I've
Mm-hmm.
gravitated a lot towards reading a lot about psychedelic assisted therapy,
Uh-huh.
and MDMA is one that shows to be very promising for PTSD. And when
Mm-hmm.
you look at the mechanisms of MDMA, It's you get inundated with the 5-HT2A receptors, and it makes you more empathic, and it makes you able to deal with these adverse situations in a more loving and friendly way. And I'm like, what can we do with exercise that can mimic that in a sense? And my thought is that like maybe we'll do some high intensity interval training for like 20 minutes, and then that'll like you said earlier, that'll start to make them focus on things. Right, within your research they were able to focus a little bit better, and then right after that have them do like a 20-minute therapy session immediately
Hmm.
after, when
Right.
they're more vulnerable, when they're able to fully express themselves, when their ego is depleted because it's left on the treadmill or on the bike.
Yeah.
Are they able to break through like they do in MDMA sessions? So that's something that I would love to be able to do research on as well, is like, how can we make them vulnerable to where we can add therapy afterwards or within the session to make them feel like they can open them? How can we expedite the
Yep.
alliance into like a couple sessions like they do with psychedelics, right?
Yeah, I think that's also right on. And the timing of these things and like how you combine, right? I mean, like there's a whole literature on like how you combine therapy and medication. That's been there forever. It was like one of the first papers I ever worked on was the combination, therapies, medication plus therapy, plus CBT, does that work better than either one alone? And there are a lot of complex answers to that question. But I think there are all sorts of, and people are now futzing with the timing of those things. What if you do therapy first and then do medication for maintenance, or you do medication first, and what kind of medication? Is it an immediate effect of like doing propranolol for veterans, with PTSD, for instance, and like you have more of a window to work with memories if you hit them with this medication first, and then you can do prolonged exposure therapy. I also worked with veterans during my internship at the Boston Consortium, the National Center for PTSD, when I was there. Um, and I think there's also things we could talk about in terms of like the military training that's also very similar to kind of sport performance. Some of the stuff that I know you're probably much more intimately, aware of, but the psychological skills that veterans get trained with. Um, but this notion of timing, I think, and staging is really important. One thing that I've noticed lately that speaks directly to the kind of experiment you just put out there is what I've been noticing when I'm kind of freaked out about something and I go run. So running is my go-to. If I'm freaked out about something and I run, during the run, it actually makes it worse.
Yeah.
you know I'm trying to use my psychological skills, but I've activated the system, right? So I'm stressing my body out already. And if I'm mentally stressed, sometimes it doesn't make it easier, it actually makes it worse, and I feel worse during the run. But then what happens is as soon as I'm done with the run, there's like this wave of just like relaxation that comes over, even more so than when I'm not trying to work through a problem during the run. I actually feel more relief. And so I think there is something to this, like you activate the system first. Physiologically there are mechanisms, but I also think psychologically, you're stressing the system, and then you're allowing the system to kind of come down and recover from the stress. And there might be a special window in there during that recovery period where, right, people are more open. People are more open, more willing, maybe because of depletion, maybe because of some of the other mechanisms that are actually like increasing willingness or acceptance, or an openness to experience that kind of mimics the MDMA stuff too. That I think that sort of staging would be really interesting to look at as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something that comes to mind whenever I do ultra marathons, and I do a lot of hiking.
Good for you.
And yeah, thank you. And the idea is that like maybe the first, like with a hike, let's say you do like a 25-mile hike to go camping, the first like 18 to 20 miles, you're inundated with like junk, right? It's just like
Yeah.
these thoughts that come in your mind, these songs that you just can't get out of your head. So if you go
Right.
into it like ultra stressed, you're going to think about that. You're going to ruminate, and you're going to and what I found was like there's a certain point in time where if you put in enough effort, your brain starts to say like, oh, we've done this enough, now we can let you like truly think about what you want to think about. And
Right.
it's like you almost allow the muse to come in, and then you can start thinking about like interceptive things. Like the ego's gone because you just destroyed it through exercise. And
Right,
now you're
right.
able to get like into the deeper, thoughtful stuff. So I think there is a big component of that idea of like dopamine with effort versus dopamine without effort.
Sure.
You start to get these
Yes.
extra, like everything just kind of works together. Like your body, it almost is like your body and brain like it gives you a reward for the effort that you're doing. And it could be within that window that you can have these sessions, and you
Yeah.
can
I
get.
mean, what's interesting, the paradox that you even just like highlighted, sorry to cut you off there, but like it just made me think about this paradox that's there with what we're talking about is, you know, exercise can kind of deplete the ego or the frontal brain, but at the same time we know that if you exercise at least moderately, like it boosts attention. So I think there's like it's depleting something about the ego maybe, but like actually enhancing other pieces of it. If we're going to stay in the kind of ego concept for now, is like it does it does seem to like increase some sort of like attention or willingness or maybe openness of attention, while at the same time kind of depleting in a way the little chatterbox, maybe. So it's like it's not a full depletion of the frontal cortex or ego, so to speak. It's like it's a depletion of kind of the noisy parts of it. And so maybe it's kind of a signal to noise that it shifts with exercise, is it like boosts the signal and decreases the noise through some of these mechanisms that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that's at least that's the way I think of it, is like you're right. Like we do know the prefrontal cortex gets all this oxygen and gets better
Right.
delivery. And I feel like the default mode network gets quieted down
Quieted
towards
down.
the end, right? And the
Right.
same thing you see
Yep.
with meditation, and
Yeah.
that's the exact same thing you see with psychedelics.
Right.
One of the leading researchers in psychedelic assisted therapy has this idea. His name is Robin Carhart Davis, and he has this idea of that mental health disorders come from too much order in the brain. Your brain's
Mm.
constantly trying to have these error
Mm.
predictions, and it's trying to shape the way we see the world. And with
Mm.
depression, you can get into this, ruminative state of like, I can't do
Yeah.
anything. So
Yeah.
what
It's a
psychedelics does,
closed, it creates a closed system. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
psychedelics does is it puts you a little bit more towards chaos, and it allows
Hmm.
you to dive into these other areas. And that's his
Yeah.
hypothesis on mental health disorders and why psychedelics seem to be
Makes sense
so
to me.
impactful. And I think hard exercise can have the same
Has that
same effect.
potential.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
totally. No, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Open. It's kind of like opening the mind and the brain to possibility or different ways of thinking, or openness to different experiences, which is very much the MDMA stick, right? Is that it's opening you up to these, like you're just willing to hear and say and feel. And I think exercise. I think you're absolutely. That's what I've started to have the same. I think you're absolutely right. I'm having similar sort of intuitions and insights with my own exercise and some of the research that we're doing, that yeah, maybe it does. It's like it opens you up. It's the same sort of like critical window that, I don't know if you know about that work with propranolol, um, where with military veterans, this is Liz Phelps at NYU. She had done some research where it's like propranolol kind of like opens up the system, more willingness in a way, it like quiets things down, and it quiets the sympathetic system, opens people up maybe more to going through their trauma memory. It didn't totally work out. It kind of works, but it kind of doesn't. But like this same idea of like what are situations in which, and I tend to be the non-pharmacologic, interested in non-pharmacologic means and rather movement and physical activity in our own minds, is like how can we create situations where people are more open and willing to be chaotic, so to speak, to open up their system? Because this is what I talk to my clients a lot about too. It's just like so many clients come in and be like, oh, I'm so broken in a way with my symptoms. I'm like, actually, it's really functional what's happened to you,
Yeah,
is
right.
your system has become organized in a way this way, and it quote unquote works. Like that's how it works. What we need to do is we need to mess with it, right? We need to tell it there's actually different ways of doing things. Like you can go out on a Friday night with your friends and have fun. You can speak up in class, raise your hand, and things go okay. So in a way, it's actually very functional. It's not dysfunctional. It's just functioning very well in a way that you don't like, that doesn't work for you. So like we have to we have to disrupt and like perturbate that system to open it up to different ways of organizing, which I think, we're on the same page there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the things that you've experienced, like experiment with research, is the change in the belief system through
Hmm.
placebo trials, where you told them
Yeah.
this is a placebo, but if you take it, it'll be effective.
It'll
And
still work.
yeah, and some of the research. Are you familiar with Aaliyah Crumb's research out of Stanford?
Crumb sounds so familiar, but I'm not, it's not coming to mind.
Yeah, so she's done a lot of research with beliefs and changing your perceptions. And one of the ones that is really famous is the housemaids research, where they took this group of housemaids and they asked them if they thought their work was exercise. And
Mm,
one group, they all said no, they don't think it's exercise. So one group was put into this work is not exercise, and then the other group was put into this, we're going to teach you your work is exercise.
is
And
exercise.
yeah, and they didn't change anything. They didn't change their eating habits. They didn't change anything other than their mindset. And what they found was that the group that learned that their work was exercise was that they lost weight, they improved
Mm,
their blood pressure, they improved their stress response through questionnaires, and they had more well-being in their life because they thought it was exercise. So just
mhm.
those things of like shifting your belief system without actually changing anything is so
Right.
powerful, and that's something that you've done within your research. Can you elaborate on what exactly you've done with the whole belief system, placebos, and how maybe we can incorporate that into some of the stuff we've already talked about with helping people with mental health disorders?
Yeah, I think beliefs are really where the action's at. The question is, right, how do you develop healthy beliefs or leverage beliefs that we know can have, measurable impacts like on weight loss or school performance, right? So the famous early studies by Dweck showing, the intelligence mindset having an impact on actual achievement in kiddos, especially kiddos who are struggling to start. Um, so I'll get to the placebos in a second, but I think in general, beliefs and perceptions are so huge. We know that from our current, we know that from the world too, that what you believe really drives what you do and how you organize your own narrative and the narrative of the world. So I think it's a huge, huge piece of psychology that we need to pay attention to and try to leverage the good parts of it anyway. Um, there are lots of beliefs out there that are very dangerous. But I think, with growth mindset, that's where I started really with beliefs. I hadn't given beliefs that much of attention before hooking up with a graduate student of mine, Hans Schroeder, who's now at Michigan in psychiatry, and he kind of cued me into this whole growth mindset idea. And it actually started with a simple study we did where we showed that if you induce a growth mindset about intelligence in undergraduates, you can actually increase their attention to mistakes and their ability to adapt to mistakes. And it was like, very quickly in a very implicit sort of way. So it was just like a very powerful way. Hey, if we get you to think that, mistakes are good things and they're opportunities to learn, you actually do learn from your mistakes in a simple task more so than people who were given a fixed mindset that, oh, you're as smart as you're going to be. And that's that. So we did some of those experiments, but what I started to get more interested in with mental health, and we started to do more kind of questionnaire studies, was, well, maybe people have different beliefs about their own anxiety or their own depression, like where it came from or how much they can change it. And what we've shown over a bunch of studies now is that if you have a more fixed mindset about your mental health, basically, you do tend to have higher symptoms. You tend to reach for unhelpful emotion regulation strategies like substances more often. You tend to have a harder time in therapy, actually, even. Whereas the reverse is true, is if you're a more growth minded oriented person, like, hey, I have some anxiety, but I can actually change it, or it's possible for me to change my depression or whatever. If you have those sorts of beliefs, you are actually more open and amenable to intervention, and you actually bounce back more from stressors than if you think your mental health is a kind of a core component of who you are that's basically baked in. And so I think the more we can be sending messages to people in general, I think this is a piece, a huge piece of it, that we get inundated with messages about um, even biological essentialism, I think, is a really tricky bug, because we know that telling people that, depression is due to a chemical imbalance in your brain or whatever, that does actually help them feel less shameful about their disorder. The problem is it actually makes them feel like their prognosis is worse, though. That's the main issue. They think they're just going to have it forever. So that's a real double-edged sword there. So, I think one thing to think about is just like, what are we telling people about mental health? Are we telling them it's a brain disorder? Which, for most lay people, if you tell them it's a brain disorder, they don't know what that means, other than, oh crap, I'm probably screwed for life. Like, that's basically what that's how a lot of lay people understand biology. Biology is fixed, environment and personality and the mind is malleable. So I think the way we talk about biology in mental health has got to be shifted. Is like, we have to also teach people, like, biology is malleable just like anything else, honestly. Like, you can change it. I think some people have a sense of that, like, oh, if I eat more sugar, I'm going to be hyper, sort of thing. But in terms of mental health, I don't think they make those same connections. So I think there are lots of different messaging in the way we talk about people's mental health, and whether it's malleable or fixed, and whether it's biologically or genetically driven or environmentally driven. I think there's a lot we can do to make people feel more empowered, that they have control over their mental health, basically. And so that's a whole line of kind of beliefs research that I think is really important to be talking about more, and how we talk about it with our clients, and how, everything's it's all adaptable. You can strengthen. This is why I think sports and physical activity is such a great partner in mental health, is because people also know you can get stronger by going to the gym, but they don't always think about that in the same way with their minds. But I think there's a total translation, that if we continue to get people to believe that, and you see that even, obviously in this mindset research, right? You just give people a different way to think about something, and all of a sudden physically they've changed. So I think we need to keep leveraging, pushing on those levers, where you can make psychological changes that have physical effects, and physical changes that have psychological effects, because we know they work both ways. Which leads me to this research that we got interested in with my postdoc, Darwin Guevara, who's now at Miami University in Ohio. He was really interested in just the idea of placebos. Again, another kind of like a pretty big effect, which is basically a belief effect. It's an expectation effect. Similar to the mindset stuff, is like, if you expect and you believe that your anxiety is kind of fixed and there's nothing you can do about it, you're probably just going to have it forever, right? Like, that's just what's going to happen. It's going to be hard to nudge it if that's just the way you think about it. So if you think you're getting a treatment, and you are given all these expectations that you're going to get better if you keep putting this pill in your mouth, it turns out there are huge placebo effects on mental health, on IBS, on ADHD, on pain, chronic pain. And that's really kind of wild, right? Because these people are not given any biological interventions in this pill, usually, that they're getting. But if they expect it to be there, like in a blinded research study, right, of you're getting a placebo, but you don't know it, there's huge placebo effects. The problem with the placebo effect, right? Because and in depression, it's like one of the biggest. Like, depression has a giant placebo effect. Through, we see this with randomized controlled trials of antidepressants, that the majority of people with depression, who generally have mild to moderate depression, 80% of their response is due to expectations and placebo. And it works just as well as an antidepressant, which debunks the whole kind of serotonin hypothesis, which you alluded to earlier. There's a small proportion of patients who do seem to get some real benefit from serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but many of them actually are just fine with placebos. The problem is you can't do that in real life, right? Like, you can't say, I'm giving you medicine, patient, and lying to them. Like, that's not okay. Not going to fly. So what if, you know, non-deceptive placebos were an option? And so that's what Darwin really got interested in, was like, what if you just tell people they're getting a placebo, but like, you should just think that this is going to help you. And if you think it's going to help you, you'll get better. Like, let's see if that works. And there's actually a decent amount of evidence, again, mostly in like IBS and chronic pain, that if people are given a placebo and told it's a placebo, it's called non-deceptive placebo, but they're told that if you just believe in this, and they show them all sorts of data, like brain data and biological data, that says, like, if you just believe this is going to help you, it will, because look at all these placebo results out there, right? They just believed that it was going to help them, and it did. So what they found is that you can get people to have fewer IBS, and fewer sleep problems, fewer pain, less pain, even fewer ADHD symptoms by the same principle of just like they're just expecting, even though they know it. So you don't have to be tricked to get the effect, right? Now, not everybody gets it. Some people are very skeptical that they don't want to deal with. So fine, okay, they'll be jerks about it. That's okay. But if people are willing to believe it, they can get better. And what I think we're starting to learn, and I'll tell you about some of the specific studies we did really briefly in a second, but I think what we're learning is if you have the belief and expectation that something that you're doing repeatedly as part of a regimen, and you're told by it to do it by somebody with authority, and you're given enough information that's convincing to you, and you engage, and it's not, and so like that's a big piece of it, but you're also leveraging a behavior that you've likely done your whole life that has been medicinal,
Mhm.
right? It's just a learned behavior that when I take this thing that this authority figure told me to put in my body that will make me feel better, just think about the millions of times your caregiver gave you something and said, here you go, honey, you're going to feel better if you take this little red, goop in your mouth. You're just reactivating those healing properties of this learned behavior. I think that's a huge piece of it. And so just because you know that there's no active ingredient in it, you're just being given something kind of like helpful from somebody who's trying to be caring to you. And that activates all sort of like health, uh, self-healing properties, and you see these benefits. I think it's fascinating, and Darwin and I are continuing to collaborate on this stuff. But what was missing at the time that we did some of our studies is what if you did it with emotions, with emotional health? People had been doing it more with kind of like what we traditionally think of as medical, even though pain, I would still say, is psychological. Lots of people think about it as a medical condition, especially, anyway. Um, Nobody had done it with like emotions. So we did an experiment in the lab first with EEG, and then we saw effects in there, and we took it out in the real world. And so the study in the lab was pretty simple. It was literally just like we gave some people we gave them nasal spray and said, "Hey, we're going to give you this nasal spray. It doesn't have anything in it, but we're giving you this because if you think this has emotional, anti-stress properties, we're going to show you a bunch of nasty pictures that are going to stress you out. But if you take this nasal spray and you think that it's actually going to make you feel better, you're not going to have that big of a reaction to these distressing images we're about to show you." The other group, we just sprayed them with the nasal spray and said, this is just to help the EEG signals settle. And so what we found was we did it, we actually replicated ourselves, which was actually pretty amazing. Nature Communications made us do that before we got the publication in. They were like, we believed it first, but we want to see it again. And we were actually able to replicate it. It was very, very exciting. One of the first times that replicated ourselves like back to back that way,
Yeah,
which is
that's
pretty great to
crazy.
see. But what we found was that the brain signal we were looking at, this kind of brain signal is like an emotional sensitivity brain signal. It was smaller when the people were given nasal spray and told that if they think it's going to make them feel better, it did. And so that was like the first like biological data we were aware of to show that non-deceptive placebos can actually impact emotional reactivity in the moment, at least brain data. And so we took that idea and we said, hey, if it works there, let's take this into the real world. And we actually did a study during COVID for people who had high COVID stress, and we recruited them in, and half of them we just said, hey, fill out these questionnaires for the next 2 weeks. The other half we found on Amazon. There are actually placebo pills on Amazon you can buy for $20 for 30 pills, and they're called Zebo pills. It says pure placebo, like right on the bottle. And so we sent them this bottle and we said, hey, take 2 of these a day for the next 2 weeks. And the reason we want you to do that is because of this non deceptive placebo effect. We actually used our own data in doing a Zoom meeting with them to try to tell them kind of what they could expect. We said, look, we told these people to do this. It quieted their brain. Look at all these other effects you can get for pain and IBS. So if you take these pills twice a day and you think they're going to help with your COVID anxiety, they will. And sure enough, we published this paper earlier this year where the group that got the placebos who knew about it had significant decreases over 2 weeks in anxiety, COVID anxiety, depression came way down. That was the biggest effect. And it was remarkable, the big kind of treatment response we got just by telling them, if you believe this repeated activity you're going to do by putting this sugar pill in your mouth because we tell you it's going to be good for you, they got better. So
Yeah.
these beliefs and expectations and these learned behaviors that are medicinal, I think are really big.
Yeah, I mean, all that makes sense except for the nasal spray one, because all the other ones, you gave them some data that showed that the placebo effect could have,
Yeah, we
positive.
did show them that in the nasal spray one too. As part of the nasal spray, we had them do the nasal spray, and we showed them a bunch of, and like showed them like a PowerPoint, which is just like, if you do this, look at all these other data that if you do this, it does work. So we gave them. It was very similar. I forgot to mention that exactly. We just used nasal spray in that one because it kind of fit the situation. We used the Zebo pills for the other one because it kind of made sense. But we did give both of those groups the kind of rationale for why we're doing it in like a little PowerPoint talk, basically presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because the idea of educating them is something that is extremely important when it comes to any type of behavior change and placebo and
Yeah,
things along those lines. A lot of the stuff I read with like the healthy, I think it's healthy mental or healthy behavior therapy, where the idea is they come in and they teach them about the health benefits of exercise and try to get them to create their own ideas of what the benefits are, to get them to buy into the program that they're going to do. But you have to have that explicit idea of like, this is what's going to happen when you start to
yeah,
change your mind.
yep.
And so, so why do you think that's so powerful? What changes? Do we think there's like things that change in the brain? Do we think that there's things that change um, with the way they see themselves? Like, what do we think is making this change in their ability to have this effect with the emotional stuff? Because I understand with the biomedical stuff, right? You still get the same type of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you still get the same type of response. So for like pain, you still get a dullness of the pain receptors. You still get you still get the H 5-HT2A receptor bind. Like, so you still get those things. What is it that's happening with the emotional responses, do you think?
I mean, I think what at least what we saw in the brain data is that the reactivity that we expect to see in this brain signal is called the late positive potential, which we know from a lot of other research is basically a signal that comes from the visual system, but is basically turned up and turned down by the amygdala, and by the sympathetic nervous system. So the more you're activated, whether it's for aroused, basically, like if it's a really kind of distressing negative image or a really exciting positive sort of scenario, you have this big response. So I think what we're seeing with this is that we're getting a kind of implicit quieting of that distress signal, that it's just in terms of exactly the mechanisms per se. I mean, I think the cognitive system, and this is why I like this non-deceptive placebo, kind of to bring it full circle, is non-deceptive placebo is an example of an effortless strategy, because we didn't find other changes, like really big changes in like effort per se. But I think there's something we're doing with that sort of intervention that's similar to the third person self talk, which is like we've kind of switched the brain into a different mode of processing, which is a more accepting, a more open, a kind of more aware. I think it's both kind of like a more aware, but an awareness and an expectation that they kind of know what's going to happen, and they kind of know what to expect in a way, and they kind of know how to handle what's coming their way. So I think these kind of building expectations or building a perspective where you're like, I know what's going to happen, I kind of have control and there's certainty over this situation. I think that's likely a big piece of it, is just like, I'm doing something for myself that is helpful. And I think that sets the brain into a less threat mode. I think it's more in kind of like, it's more in a challenge mode, or it's more in a relaxed mode, just from the start. And I think that's why I like these sorts of strategies, because I think they're simple. And something like the non-deceptive placebo, which also brings in this other wrinkle of like, is there something you actually have to do actively each trial, or is it just like you set it up from the beginning? Because the third person self-talk, they actually get reminded to do it every time they see a distressing image. Whereas with the non-deceptive placebo, we just like put them in a mode. We're just like, hey, you just did this nasal spray, which is probably going to make you feel better if you think it is. So I think it like literally sets whether it quiets the default mode network or quiets the salience network. I think it likely has that. It's just kind of like, I think there are ways, and we kind of know this from the network analysis of the brain. I think it toggles it,
Yeah.
between I'm in a threat situation. When you come into a lab and you don't know what the heck's going on, and all of a sudden I say I'm going to start showing you pictures of gore and blood and threat, people probably turn into a threat mode a bit, right? And then they start to see that we present them with different scenarios. Some are threatening, some are boring, some might be exciting and positive. And so I think a lot of times when you're in a lab, you're already in that threat mode, which is kind of also bringing it full circle back to the anxiety, sort of stuff that we said, as people who come in these testing situations are probably in a threat mode. And so when we give them these sorts of strategies like the non-deceptive placebo, I think we switch them into a safe mode, in a way. And I think that's what that late positive potential brain potential we looked at kind of told us, is that we did quiet down. Now, and it doesn't seem like, at least from the kind of prefrontal cortex data that we have in those data, it doesn't seem like they're having to kind of like repeat and tell themselves that like everything's okay, everything's going to be fine. It seems like it just does toggle them into, this is a safe place. And I've just been given something that make me feel okay. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but like that's just where my head goes, because I don't have a lot of other physiologic measures from these studies to speak exactly what's going on. But I do think it gives people kind of like psychological safety, some psychological certainty and control. And I think that framing, that broad framing, allows people to toggle into more of a safe mode rather than a threat mode in their brain.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. A lot of the stuff that I've been reading, the idea of providing agency and certainty to people
Yeah,
seems to
it's
be
huge.
kind of a cure for a lot of mental health disorders. Because,
I mean, we know uncertainty is a huge source of anxiety and stress, like for sure.
right, yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. That definitely connects all the dots there. Um, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about. Jason, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on that we might have missed?
I think I'll just bring it all kind of full circle, and we've talked about a lot of different areas that I'm glad we're both kind of passionate about. So this has been a lot of fun, and a lot of the way I connect these things is really trying to think about overall well-being and health. That we don't have to keep these like sharp lines between this is physical, this is mental. The more we're coming together to try to bring all of the different strategies we have to help people feel healthy and well, I think is where it's going to be. And the more that we can make them palatable, easier to do, part of everyday life, making people feel stronger, more empowered, more agentic, more over control of their lives, and boosting that capacity for control. I think we have so many different tools at our disposal to help people do that, and we don't have to feel siloed. I mean, this is what I like about these sorts of conversations, is that we don't have to be siloed in our little areas, is that we actually integrating things is going to be much more impactful long term. And so the basic principles of like make it easy, make it palatable, make it acceptable, and make it something people can do and make habits out of in their daily lives from any sort of walk of life, I think is really important. And the last thing I will say though is that is a bit of a challenge that we all have to come up with, is we have to tailor this to individual needs and resources, because we have so many tools. And I think it is amazing we have all these tools and we can integrate across all these different disciplines. The problem is, how do people make choices about which ones to choose when? And so that's kind of like the next level. We've talked about lots of different ways that we could make exercise work, or we could make different sort of cognitive strategies work, or building capacity for cognitive control maybe. Now I think, if we're in that mindset and we think we can push a lever for beliefs and we can push a lever for cognitive control and whatever, we then have to really get down and dirty, which I'm doing some work with my colleague Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan, is we have to figure out like, but when should these people use these different strategies? Because and who are the people who should use these ones and not those ones? And I think that's another grand challenge is we've got so many strategies, so many fads that people want to kind of glom onto, and then they get frustrated because they don't work. We have to help people find ones that really work for them, in the intensity, in the messaging, and in the acceptability that I think is also a big piece of kind of what do we do with all these strategies that we just talked about. Is we have to figure out what works for whom when, and have people develop their own toolboxes that work for them and take those along for the ride.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. The more we adapt that biopsychosocial model to
Mhm.
individually improve everyone, is definitely the way forward. So I appreciate you coming on and spending 2 hours going over all your stuff. It's fascinating
Absolutely.
research, and I'm excited that you're interested in the same things and trying to push this field forward. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
All right, I'll talk to you soon, Jason. Thank you.
Take care.